The Way of the World is a play written by the English playwright William Congreve. It premiered in early March 1700 in the theatre in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. It is widely regarded as one of the best Restoration comedies and is still occasionally performed. Initially, however, the play struck many audience members as continuing the immorality of the previous decades and was not well received. Characters: the play is based on the two lovers, Mirabel and Millamant, originally played by John Webrucken and Anne Brace Gradle. In order for them to marry and receive Millamant's full dowry, Mirabel must receive the blessing of Millamant's aunt, Lady Wishfort. Unfortunately, Lady Wishfort is a very bitter lady who despises Mirabel and wants her own nephew, Sir Wilful, to wed Millamant. Meanwhile, Lady Wishfort, a widow, wants to marry again and has her eyes on an uncle of Mirabel's, the wealthy Sir Roland. Another character, Fennel, is having a secret affair with Mrs. Marwood, a friend of Fennel's wife. Mrs. Fennel, who is Lady Wishfort's daughter, herself once had an affair with Mirabel and remains his good friend. In the meantime, Mirabel's servant Waitwell is married to Fowell. Lady Wishfort's servant Waitwell pretends to be Sir Roland and, on Mirabel's command, tries to trick Lady Wishfort into a false engagement. Plot: Act 1 sets in a chocolate house where Mirabel and Fennel have just finished playing cards. A footman comes and tells Mirabel that Waitwell, Mirabel's male servant, and Fowell, Lady Wishfort's female servant, were married that morning. Mirabel tells Fennel about his love of Millamant and is encouraged to marry her. Witwoud and Petulant appear, and Mirabel is informed that should Lady Wishfort marry, he will lose 6,000 of Millamant's inheritance. He will only get this money if he can get Lady Wishfort's consent to his and Millamant's marriage. Act 2 is set in St. James Park. Mrs. Fennel and Mrs. Marwood are discussing their hatred of men. Fennel appears and accuses Mrs. Marwood, with whom he is having an affair, of loving Mirabel, which she does. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fennel, Mirabel's former lover, tells Mirabel that she hates her husband, and they begin to plot to deceive Lady Wishfort into giving her consent to the marriage. Millamant appears in the park and, angry about the previous night when Mirabel was confronted by Lady Wishfort, she tells Mirabel of her displeasure in his plan, which she only has a vague idea about. After she leaves, the newly-wed servants appear and Mirabel reminds them of their roles in the plan. Acts 3, 4, and 5 are all set in the home of Lady Wishfort. We are introduced to Lady Wishfort, who is encouraged by Fowell to marry the supposed Sir Roland, Mirabel's supposed uncle, so that Mirabel will lose his inheritance. Sir Roland is, however, Waitwell in disguise, and the plan is to entangle Lady Wishfort in a marriage which cannot go ahead, because it would be bigamy, not to mention a social disgrace. Waitwell is only a serving man, Lady Wishfort an aristocrat. Mirabel will offer to help her out of the embarrassing situation if she consents to his marriage. Later, Mrs. Fennel discusses this plan with Fowell, but this is overheard by Mrs. Marwood. She later tells the plan to Fennel, who decides that he will take his wife's money and go away with Mrs. Marwood. Mirabel and Millamant, equally strong-willed, discuss in detail the conditions under which they would accept each other in marriage, otherwise known as the proviso scene. The marriage conditions that is discussed in the proviso scene, showing the depth of their feeling for each other. Mirabel finally proposes to Millamant and with Mrs. Fennell's encouragement, almost consent as Millamant knows of their previous relations. Millamant accepts. Mirabel leaves as Lady Westford arrives, and she lets it be known that she wants Millamant to marry her nephew, Sir Wilful Witwoud, who has just arrived from the countryside. Lady Westford later gets a letter telling her about the Sir Rowland plot. Sir Rowland takes the letter and accuses Mirabel of trying to sabotage their wedding. Lady Westford agrees to let Sir Rowland bring a marriage contract that night. By Act 5, Lady Westford has found out the plot, and Fennel has had Waiteville arrested. Mrs. Fennel tells Fowell that her previous affair with Mirabel is now public knowledge. Lady Westford appears with Mrs. Marwood, whom she thanks for unveiling the plot. Fennel then appears and uses the information of Mrs. Fennel's previous affair with Mirabel and Millamant's contract to marry him to blackmail Lady Westford, telling her that she should never marry and that she is to transfer her fortune to him. Lady Westford offers Mirabel her consent to the marriage if he can save her fortune and honor. Mirabel calls on Waiteville, who brings a contract from the time before the marriage of the Fennels, in which Mrs. Fennel gives all her property in trust to Mirabel. This neutralizes the blackmail attempts, after which Mirabel restores Mrs. Fennel's property to her possession and then is free to marry Millamant with the full 12,000 inheritance. So there is the end, and